the upcoming presidential election? Courtney? Are we going to pass the mic? Thanks. So I'm going to ask you two to tell us your name.
Courtney. I'm
Hi.
Courtney. Nice to be here. There were two things I was aware of this time. One is the difference between being alone in my home practice and being with people. Different feeling. And another thought was that it's funny not to have a goal.
Funny not to what?
Not to have a goal. I mean, I guess we have a goal.
A goal.
The goal of coming back to the breath. But even that could be, how well am I coming back to the breath? How often am I coming back to the breath? How well am I doing it not judging myself? It's just endless. And it's very, it feels very non-instinctual not to have something to progress to. And it's nice not to as well.
Anyone else?
Sure, why not? I'm Tim, and that was the first time I tried meditating with my eyes not closed. And it's interesting. I appreciate what you said about building a skill that can be used in everyday life, because walking down the street in New York City with my eyes closed is probably not a winning strategy. But it also made me think of my asana practice, where I've caught myself closing my eyes in order to minimize distractions on the mat. And I think it's exactly the same kind of cheating. So thank you. I appreciate that help.
You're welcome. Yeah, I mean, people usually close their eyes because they want to achieve more peace. But the fact is that the best kind of peace that you can achieve is simply cutting that anxious thought and coming back into the present moment and relaxing into this. I experience it, I don't know, maybe some others do here, most powerfully in the morning. When I first wake up and I'm lying in bed before I get out of bed, and I find my mind racing in thought, oftentimes anxious thoughts. And then finally I sort of pry myself out of bed because those thoughts are very gripping, compelling. And I pry myself out of bed and I go into the bathroom and brush my teeth and pee and, go about my day, start my day. And the very physicalness of the world, the sink, the floor, the walls, my body in motion, cuts through those thoughts and they evaporate as though they were mist. They might hang on a little bit, but nothing like they were when I was just lying there in bed. And really that is the action of meditation. And that, when we talk about the well-being that meditation can bring, it has to do with coming back to awareness of our world and as it arises. And that world consists of what are called in Buddhism the six knowables. And the six knowables are very simply objects of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mind. Those are the six things we can know. And when we come back to the way those things arise and pass away in the present, that anxious dream is cut. And more than that, ultimately it begins to change who we are, who we think we are, literally, because we stop thinking about who we are in the world. And there's a tremendous freedom that can bring, and groundlessness as well, as one comes back into the present and gives up the dreams. I mean, these dreams that we have, they're stories that we tell ourselves, fragments of them, more or less complete at different times. And they're always about a hero or a heroine, which is me, I. I'm the hero or the heroine of my dream. And in those dreams, those fragments are full-blown. I, the hero, heroine, is on a journey towards an object of desire, whatever it may be, a better way to be in life. And that journey invites obstacles. Any journey does. If there are no obstacles and we get the object of our desire, easily, then it's over. And it was a boring little story, right? What makes it interesting and compelling and exciting and gripping is when obstacles present themselves, as they most often do. And so here we are, the hero or the heroine, trying to get to where we want to be, full of anxiety about will it happen. It's kind of like, I always think of it as the perils of Pauline. Back in the 19th century, there were these melodramas that toured the United States in, covered wagons, and they would entertain people. And, they tell the story of Pauline, the heroine, who's tied to the railroad tracks, and the hero, I forget his name, will he save her before the train comes and runs her over? And that's kind of the way we live our lives. We're always sort of involved in one way or another. Sometimes we're involved in very pleasant dreams, like dreams of pleasure. But even those are fraught with a subtle underlying unhappiness, because we know that whatever that pleasure is, it's temporary, it's transient. And that underlying, knowledge that we're trying to ignore is still there, eating at us. So really, what we're doing when we practice, when we meditate, is we are shifting our loyalty from those dreams, those anxious, sort of melodramatic dreams, structured dreams about a hero or a heroine, to simple, open awareness of what is arising in the present moment. And using the breath, giving our loyalty to the breath, or allegiance to the breath, is simply a handle to come back into the present, like to pull ourselves out of the dream back in. It's really so interesting. It might begin to feel very groundless as you begin to give up those stories completely. And it might suggest that who we literally thought we were, me, John, Tim, Michael, Joe, whomever, we're not. We're something much more open dimensional as we move through this constantly changing present. But we think of ourselves as being this person with a past and a future. And we remember our pasts, and we have regrets and prides about our accomplishments and regrets about the sufferings, and we have these hopes for the future. There's a thing we do in Buddhism to remind ourselves of certain key facts. They're contemplations, and there are different sets of them. And one of them that I like comes from, it's a set of 7 reminders that comes from the Dzogchen tradition. And one of the reminders is that the thoughts of the past and the future are just dreams, fictions, just like you might see created on TV. Now, there's always truth to any part, elements of truth in any fiction. But fundamentally, they're fiction. And when we think about the past, think about it, if you were to leave here and describe what happened, and in fact, let's say everybody left here and described what happened, wrote it down, and then you compared it, everyone would be different, one to the next. There would be certain common elements, but it would be vastly different. Because the so-called histories that we tell ourselves are really very, very particular, selective, biased, prejudiced. They come from our past trainings, what we think was, we're told was important, scary, promising. And we focus and see those things and we ignore everything else. So in this particular reminder about these thoughts about the past and the future, they say that thoughts about the past and future are no more real and meaningful and enduring than last night's dream. Think about that one. We have this dream from last night. You wake up in the morning, you remember it for a moment, and then you get up and you forget about it. You go about your day. We do the same thing with our thoughts about the past and the future, although they come back. They come back. But when they come back, they're always a little different each time. Different setting. They morph. And they're no more significant than last night's dream. They're just dreams. And so the practice is to begin to become real, to begin to become authentic, to come back into the present, which means giving up these stories, which could be very interesting. Might change our whole orientation of what we're about and be very radical. Yes, one. Wait, wait for the mic so that everybody can hear you.
Hello. I want to go back to what you were saying in the beginning. That you said that you were lying in bed and then for thoughts, and they were tearing you.
I'm sorry, that was what?
You're full of thoughts, and then they were tearing you in different directions. But as soon as you wake up, and the physical world reminds you, and then kind of pull you together. But I want to say that is it possible that without our body, I mean, this is dream, the continuum, the dream is continuum to our daily life. Without our body, the dream is continuum. So, and our everyday reality, it's what put this linear, continuum, and what makes sense, But without our body, and the dream keep going on. So maybe
and the dream what?
Keep goes on, and then it's all it's a fragmented, and it doesn't have to make sense. And so for people who lost consciousness, and they are like in the sleep all the time, and so they don't have the everyday life to remind them of this continuum reality. And so if we kind of, and also we meditate, it's the same thing. We go back to that dreaming state, and that all the thoughts are fragmented, and may or may not make sense. So that being said, that when we give up our body, where were we?
When we give up our body?
Yeah, when our body just drop.
When we die, you mean?
Yes. Where exactly where are we?
What happens when the body dies?
Yes. So only the thought that remains.
What?
The thought and the dream continue, or
Yes. That's a big subject, and it has to do with the teachings, especially in the Tibetan tradition, about what happens after physical death. And I think the main point, before we, rather than getting into that big subject, when many people don't believe that there is that anything continues after death, and rather than get into that, I'll simply say this: that in the Buddhist tradition, the essence really of the Buddhist teachings is that, in fact, I was just reading. Rochelle sent me something. No, I was thinking of something else that was in there. There was a great teacher, Suzuki Roshi. He was the master of Zen Center. And my teacher and he met in the early 70s, and I met him too. And he was a wonderful, wonderful person, and great, very profound person. And one of his students, Alan Chadwick, wrote a biography of Roshi. It's called Crooked Cucumber, which is a translation of his name. Not Suzuki Roshi, but another name he had. And in the introduction, Alan describes once sitting with Roshi and asking him if you could sum up the essence of Buddhism in just a few words, not expecting an answer. And Roshi simply said, everything changes. And in this text that Rochelle sent me recently, there was a description of the head of one of the four main sects of Tibetan Buddhism is the Kagyu sect, and the head of the Kagyu sect is the Karmapa. And when the Karmapas die, they have rebirth, and so we're currently on the 17th Karmapa, just as we're on the 14th Dalai Lama. And the 16th, at one point, I forget the circumstance, but he said the exact same thing. He was asked to sum up the essence of Buddhism in just a few words, and he just simply said, everything changes. And from that perspective, you see the physical death of our body is just another grosser example of the change that we're experiencing all the time. Right now, the words come out of my mouth, and they're born, and they die. This meeting has a beginning, a middle, and then we'll all get up and we'll leave, and it will be over. There are endless births and deaths going on. And in Buddhism, the ultimate, or you might say the grossest, most powerful example of that kind of death is the death of the physical body. I mean, you can lose an arm, you can lose an eye, you can lose your car, you can lose your lover, your mother, your child. But when you die, it's the greatest loss of all, because you lose not only your body, but you lose the whole world. So it's the most shocking example of change and of loss. But when I heard Trungpa Rinpoche giving this teaching, and after he said this, a woman, an elderly woman, probably younger then than I am now, raised her hand and asked him for reassurance. I could hear it in her voice, that there was something that continued after physical death. And she said, how do you know that there is such a thing as rebirth? I mean, I make a gesture, and it's born and it dies, and then there's a new one that's born. It's just constant death and rebirth happening. And she said, how do you know that there's such a thing as rebirth? And then he said probably the second most profound thing I've ever heard about Buddhism. He said, because it's always now. And that is what we all, as practitioners, are working with. That is the reality that is bedrock, that is immutable, that it's not a matter of opinion. Has it ever been any other time than this? We can go off to Tallahassee with our mother in our dreams, and then we wake up and here we are, back in now. This is it. To quote Ram Dass, for those of you who know who he is. So there are a vast number of teachings. There's a whole body of teachings. I teach up at another venue called the Westchester Buddhist Center up in Irvington. And we just finished a course on these teachings about death. But they're really, really about life. Because they're all about death and rebirth, and that's happening now. Death and rebirth. So how we deal with our lives, that's going to be how we deal with our deaths. The physical world is a great aid because it pulls us back. And when we go to sleep at night, we lose that world and we devolve into our dreams, which means that we devolve into our habitual, neurotic patterns of thinking. And they spin us off into dreams. We don't have anything to sort of pull us back out of those thoughts until we wake up in the morning. And that's one of the risks of losing a body. But I don't know if that addresses some of this. Yes, Tim.
I felt a strong connection to what you said about the mind racing. I had 2 stories in the last 6 months that I found to be interesting because they were unprecedented in my experience. Both involved waking up in the middle of the night with what other people describe as a panic attack. And so there's some stress going on in my life, as I'm sure everyone's, but this was perhaps a little more concentrated than normal. And it was very unpleasant, as you can imagine, or perhaps you know for yourself if it's ever happened to you, but it was very much of a racing mind kind of thing. And I thought, what's a good strategy here? And I thought, maybe I should get up and sit, because it might not make it better, but it couldn't possibly make it worse.
That's great.
And so I set my little timer that I use for half an hour, and I plopped myself down on the yoga block that I use instead of a cushion. And sure enough, I found the breath to be very much like a life preserver, which others might describe as a round version of the handle that you described. I wouldn't say that it made the problem go away, but it definitely recalibrated my perception of a problem that probably wasn't even a problem. But the breath was a place of refuge for me. And then when it happened again, I was like, oh, haha, I know how to deal with this.
Oh, that's great.
And it was just as effective on the second go-round. So
yeah, it is.
Thank you, John.
And also, you can take that kind of a thought and make it the object of your awareness. In other words, in order to become aware of it, you have to step out of it. Otherwise you're still doing it. And as soon as you say, oh yeah, there is that repetitive thought again, thinking, you distance yourself from it. You become aware. Mingyur Rinpoche talked about this in his talk up at Riverside. And you create a kind of sanity, because you step out of the speed and the forward momentum of that thought. That's one of the main virtues of meditation altogether, is that we, by our willingness to sit and stop and say, okay, now I'm going to meditate, whatever your practice is, you're switching your allegiance from those neurotic, speedy, ongoing dreams of past and future to awareness in the present. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. In my case, I would see the experience that I was having as spinning, that the thoughts were going around and around and around and around. And eventually, when I was able to grab onto the breath, I was able to recognize that the spinning was a real phenomenon in the present moment, but it wasn't me.
Right.
So the spinning had sucked me in somehow. And once I was able to find a handhold, I was able to recognize it. And once I recognized it, it dissipated. Not like the icon on the dock, but close enough that I was able to get through the rest of the night. So
there's a thing that works for me. In the Tibetan tradition, there are what are called a chant that I often start my practice with. It's called the 4 dharmas of Gampopa. And it goes, and as soon as I've done it for so many years now, that as soon as I start to say it, my mind comes present. I like the effect. Sasha's nodding, yes, and it's just like a little magical thing. But it's only recently that I've begun to understand the 4th. Is it 4? 3? How many dharmas? 4. The 4th one. Here's what they are. It says, grant your blessing. And understand, you're talking to somebody external, but really what you're doing is you're addressing the wisdom that doesn't belong to anybody. It's not mine, it's not out there. So when I'm addressing Gampopa and asking him for his blessing, what I'm really doing is I'm saying, let this happen, and let this wisdom arise, this clarity. So it says, grant your blessings so that my mind may be one with the Dharma. That means just, so I can do this practice without even thinking. Grant your blessings so that Dharma will progress along the path. Grant your blessing so that the path will clarify confusion. We all want that. Grant your blessing so that confusion will dawn as wisdom. And that one has bothered me for years. And actually, Pema helped me with this a lot. When she talked about taking thought as the object of meditation. That when you take thought as your object, instead of making it an enemy, like you have to get rid of it, like it's a plague, like it's torturing you, but when you make it the object of your meditation, truly, and you say, aha, there it is. And you're not going to hold on to it, that would be fishy, but you just are bringing awareness to it. It becomes so that confusion dawns as wisdom. That's how it happens. That's how you have confusion becoming wisdom. When you actually bring awareness to it non-judgmentally, not trying to get rid of it. But that's you can experiment with
it. When you say the thought helps you dawns as wisdom, or the confusion dawns as wisdom, is it because when you see it, that you recognize it actually tells you about yourself, about your mind, and how it's working, or is it something different, more general than that?
It's not even that. It's not that. It does. It might give you some interesting information, but it's only interesting for a little while. But where it dawns as wisdom is because you have stepped into awareness rather than following out some anxious storyline. Well, if I do this, that's going to happen, and I've got to avoid that, and maybe I can get this, and and we're in this melodrama, and instead you say, "Oops, look what I was doing," and you step back and you see it, and you divorce your loyalty to it, and you say, "Okay, that's not me," and you let it go, and you instead give your loyalty to this present moment. This is who I am. This thing goes off all the time.
Well, it's very thrifty with the batteries. I've heard that described as a gap, and that's something that makes sense to me as well, so that I had more problems than I do now, because I've got a long way to go with disturbing emotions, like anger, for example. There was a time, particularly when I was younger, when I thought I was angry, and I've realized that there's a huge difference between I'm angry and anger is arising.
Are we out of battery?
When anger is arising, it's separate from me. And when I take ownership of it, I'm taking a poison into myself. But it's possible with a little bit of practice to... Who knows? It's possible to recognize that it exists so that I'm not pushing it away, but it's not me. I'm separate from anger and frustration, and so that's the gap.
Right.
Anger is arising, but I'm not angry. Frustration can arise without taking control of me. So the idea that you were talking about, where confusion becomes knowledge when I recognize that it's confusion. Oh, it's that again. Does that sound right?
Even more radical, that when you come into the present moment fully, there is no you. You is just a thought, I. And it literally is a statement that takes place in your head, like you could almost record it. You know, if you had something that would record thoughts the way we record sound. But when you come into the present, those thoughts, they just dissolve. And instead, there's the fullness of this space, of the present moment. And there is no I. And that all those stories evaporate for however long. It might be a split second, it might be, depends on the individual, you know, however long. That's the gap, you know. So you can have tremendous freedom. You know, actually next week, the subject, continuing on this theme of meditation, is going to be about working with emotions. And really, we're not trying to get rid of them. It's the same damn thing. We're trying to become aware of them. And in the teachings, what they say is, and we'll talk more about this, it's just like, you know, confusion is transformed into wisdom. The kleshas, the emotions, passion, aggression, you know, anger, jealousy, can be transformed into wisdom. And that's the path. And in fact, it's a very powerful one. And there are techniques for it and things to understand how to do it a bit. But it always has at its core allegiance to awareness of what is happening in the present. Without purpose, without goal. And the funny thing is, you know, to Courtney, to what you said, we're giving up our purpose, our purposefulness. And instead, we're willing to sort of be here in the present, ready to respond to whatever needs our response. And so we become much more available and open to the world around us, because we're not lost in our little dreams and fears and projects. And I'll leave you with this thing, too, that once I heard Trungpa Rinpoche asked, what is the purpose of fear? And he said, the purpose of fear is to prove that I exist. It's to it's another way of keeping that whole melodrama, the perils of Pauline, about the hero or the heroine, going. You know, that's what fear is. It's the mechanism. And when you let it go, anyhow, yes, Rochelle wants to say something.
That's a really good point. Is this on? To keep it going. Because people are always talking about, oh, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of that. And then that just continually brings attention to them. But what I wanted to say was, one of the things that I think is the perception of what meditation practice is that people think they have to work at making their mind blank. And the way that mind functions, the function of mind is just thoughts are always coming and going. And it's never about just never having thoughts. It's just about relaxing with the fact that that's the way mind functions. And once we relax with that, then whatever comes up in our mind, whatever the thought is during practice or even during post-meditation practice, we just recognize it as a thought. And then it's just totally up to us what we want to do with that. With practice, we come back to the awareness of being present. And in post-meditation, if a thought arises, because we have that experience of meditation practice, we can then work with it in a different way if we choose to. And I think that's where the wisdom comes in.
Well said. Wisdom and kindness, both. That when we begin to let go of these anxious dreams, we can become much more kind and responsive to the world. I was thinking, as I came down here, about a movie I saw that I liked a lot. In fact, I've seen it a number of times. It's the latest version by Walt Disney of Cinderella. It's really, really lovely. I think it's the best version of Cinderella I've ever seen. And in it, Cinderella goes to her mother who's dying. Her father's already died. And she's about to be orphaned and left to the tender mercies of her stepmother. And her mother doesn't know what's going to happen, but she calls Cinderella to her and gives her parting words of advice. And really, they're almost the theme of these talks. She says, have courage and be kind. It's so sweet. And really, the courage that we're talking about here is the courage to give up those dreams, those anxious, fearful, often dreams of who we think we are, and have come back to the present moment, because we're giving up our reference points and our plans, for self-protection and for the future. And instead we're saying, I'm willing to be a citizen of the universe, responsive to anything and everything that comes my way. And there are all these stories of great yogis and great religious people who gave up the world, right, in one way or another. There are also some who didn't give up the world, but that's their particular karma. And a lot of them gave up the world and they became beggars or whatever, wandering around. And what that really is saying is, because we're all so concerned with material well-being, and I think it's addressing that issue that it's possible to even give up the fear of poverty and come back into the present, that particular dream, which is a very powerful and gripping dream, and live in the present moment, responsive to whatever presents itself. We're going to be doing a course up in Westchester this winter. I'm really looking forward to it. Derek is putting it together, called, it's going to be based, we're going to start with one of the great classics of Tibetan Buddhism. It's called The Words of My Perfect Teacher, by a great teacher named Patrul Rinpoche. And there's an extraordinary commentary to it by a man named Khenpo Naga. Also, he's got a lot of different names. And we're going to use the commentary as well. And I love the stories about Patrul Rinpoche. He lived in the 1700s, I think. And so here's a Patrul Rinpoche story. He was this famous teacher, right, in his day, while he was still alive. But he lived like without a care for anything. So one day he's traveling across the steppes, of the plateaus of Tibet, and he doesn't have any pot to pee in, but he has a bit of food, and he comes across a woman who's traveling as well with her 2 children. Her husband has died, and she's having a very hard time. So he offers to share his food with her and to help carry the children and get them. And he's heading towards a monastery where he's been invited to come and give teachings. And she doesn't know this. She just sees him as sort of a wandering beggar type. And so they travel across the plains and they get to the monastery. And at the gate of the monastery, she thanks him profusely and says, I know this is a little sudden, but would you consider marrying me? And he politely declines, and then says, but come inside, with me into the monastery, and stay for a little while, and we'll see if we can, if something can be done to help you. So she stays and she spends the night there, and the next day he's giving teaching. And there's a big assembly, and he's up on the teacher's throne, and she's sitting at the back, and she sees him, and she realizes who he is. He's this great teacher, Patrul Rinpoche. And she's mortified, that she would have done such a thing. So he finishes the teaching, and at the end of the teaching, as is customary, one of the monks comes up and presents the teacher's gift, which is a lot of money, in a silk scarf, a kata. And he accepts the gift, stands up, walks down through the monks, hands it to her, and walks out the door, and wanders across the plains. This is a classic, typical, there are probably 100 stories like this about Patrul Rinpoche. And what it's demonstrating, whether or not, that isn't saying that we have to be like that. But what it's demonstrating is the complete fearlessness, the courage to live in the present moment and to do what is appropriate, what is asked of us. A person comes up and says hello, and you say hello back. It's that simple in the present moment, to step out of our dreams. I'm talking to myself as I'm talking to you.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think you never know what it's going to look like when that scene comes together. I love the stories that you tell about Patrul Rinpoche. It's almost like the confusion when you were talking before about the 4 dharmas, John. I was thinking about how the confusion, how do we say, the path, grant your blessing so that the path may clarify confusion. But it almost seems like sometimes, at least, maybe, I don't know, the confusion is necessary.
Confusion what?
Is necessary.
Necessary.
That like with the Patrul Rinpoche story, it comes out of confusion and misconceptions and seeing another person, another being as something stereotyped.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't it?
That's a wonderful point.
I was thinking I was really thinking about Patrul Rinpoche about a week ago.
Yeah.
I was on a subway train going into Manhattan. It was a Sunday, and the train was slow, and I was late to where I was going, so I was getting like antsy. And then there was this man on the train. He was a real Patrul Rinpoche type of person. He very well have been really crazy. I think he might have been. I don't know. But he was sitting on the train with this big, what do you call it, an artist's tablet? What do you call it? He had big sheets of drawing paper. And he was making portraits of people on the train. And the whole time that he was doing this, he was talking. And I started to make notes about what he was saying, because he would say things like, the important thing is to, wake up, just wake up. He was saying stuff like that and drawing pictures of people. And at first the people wouldn't trust him. They would look confused. They would look scared of him or distrustful. And then he just kept going and gave them the portraits of themselves, each person. And as each person left, the whole scene was changed. He had courage and kindness, and he was willing to be that crazy in that moment, to offer it to people. And also, it's contagious, I think, don't you? It's contagious.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah, very much. Tim, what's...
I haven't heard that story before, but I'm grateful for it. What struck me about it is the idea of clarity, like what's actually really happening here. Clearly, he's wandering across the plains because that's what he does. He's not going to the monastery so that he can give a teaching, get the money, and buy himself a BMW, because the wandering will be less burdensome. So he receives the gift, the dana, and this woman and her children need it, and he doesn't. And when he gives another teaching, there'll be another offering. So to me, it seems like almost like diamond-like clarity of purpose. I'm not going to the monastery to earn my living. I'm going to the monastery because my Dharma requires me to give this teaching. That's my duty. And the result of that is this money, which I can give to this person who needs it. It's like boom, 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 boom. In my imagination, he wouldn't even have to think twice about it. It was the most obvious thing in the world. But I can't speak for him. That's my interpretation.
I think that's great. Yeah. One.
I think we all have the role play, and the woman's playing the role of a mother. So it's very logical for her to to cling to the provider for the children. And the Rinpoche can see through that. And his role is a teacher. So their paths crossed. And so therefore, he's playing his role very well, and she's playing her role very well. And he's not putting any judgment on her at all. And I think they're both happy in the end.
That's lovely.
Can't resist another Patrul Rinpoche story. Patrul Rinpoche was a great teacher, and he had a big monastery, but he just traveled like a yogi. The only thing he owned when he traveled was a teapot and a copy of the Bodhicharyavatara, the words of the Shantideva's A Bodhisattva Way of Life. And then the book that he wrote that he's famous for, called The Words of My Perfect Teacher, he wrote it sitting on like a little cliff, looking out into the great expanse. He just sat and wrote the book.
Yeah.
So.
And he didn't call it my words. He called it the words of my perfect teacher. You know, like
yeah.
it's not his wisdom. It's his teacher's wisdom. It's
a great book to read I read it when I was doing Nundro practice.
When you were where?
Doing Nundro practice.
Oh, Nundro, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a particular practice in Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah.
Nundro. It's a very intense practice. That book isn't for everybody, though. I mean, it's almost like a Buddha, sort of Bible Belt Buddhism. It's really fierce. He describes the hells.
Yeah.
And
you're so terrified. You feel like, well, I better practice now because what's waiting for me is worse.
Yeah, the 9 cold and the 9 hot hells, and he describes them in detail. And he goes on and on. I love the part. He talks a lot about how when you're living in confusion, sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad. It just goes round and around and around and around. Happiness, unhappiness, happiness, unhappiness. And he said, if you're rich, you'll be poor. If you're poor, you'll be rich. If you're famous, you'll be unknown. If you're unknown, you'll become world-renowned. If you're loved, you'll be hated. It goes on and on like this. You'll just experience it all. It goes around. And then he tells this story about this kingdom where there was a rain of food, and everybody was very happy. And then there was a rain from the sky of clothes, and everybody was really happy. And then there was a rain of mud, and everybody died. That's the end of the story. Oh boy. He's pretty fierce. I think so. It's been a long time since I've read it. It's pretty scary. Well, we should end, I think. I was thinking about, all through this, about Michael, who has promised to give us a talk on the use of meditation in his work, working with people who have anxiety disorders and PTSD. And I'm really looking forward to hearing that because, it's one thing for all of us who are relatively, what's the word I want, untraumatized individuals, to work on coming back to the present, and it's hard enough for us. But people who are more distressed, more caught in their dreams, I'm really interested to hear how you work with them. Because really, ultimately, it is the only practice, and yet how you do it skillfully, how you can help people to wake up from the dreams which terrorize us. I mean, you described it, I've described panic, I've had panic attacks, certainly. And panic attacks are always, always, always about the stories we tell ourselves, about what we're caught in this story, about this terrible thing that's going to happen, and we can't see how we're going to get out of it. It's going to be awful, and blah, 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 and you feel the panic welling. And it's how do you get out of that? So, one way or another, that's what this practice is about coming back to sanity. If there are no further comments, I think we should end. The air conditioner has been turned off. And so, I don't know. I think we're not going to do any Buddhist chants and to end this. Often if we're doing should we dedicate the merit? Okay. We'll do a chant called Dedicating the Merit. What this means is that any benefit that we think that I have gotten from this, we dedicate it for the benefit of others. And really what we're doing is giving up that burden of selfishness and ego that makes our lives so unhappy. So here's the dedication of merit by those who have memorized it because they're in the tradition. You can, if you don't know it, you can just listen. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you all. Coming out on a hot night.